the remarkable attack that they launched on electronic devices, pagers, walkie-talkies, and so on, which appeared to impact on 3,000 or more members of Hezbollah, along with some civilians who were killed in the process. There's a big debate about whether that was lawful. The law is quite complex in that regard, in the sense that, for want of a better phrase, booby trapping people through electronic devices, if you can't guarantee that they are enemy combatants, but could also impact on civilians, then that could be a breach of international law. That could be a war crime. What do you think of that?
I think it was a war crime. I think that it was an indiscriminate way of attacking Lebanon or attacking Hezbollah. They had to know that lots of civilians were going to have those pagers and would be maimed or killed as a result. And even though, there is no question that Hezbollah fighters would die in the process or be wounded in the process, there was going to be, indiscriminate killing of lots of civilians. And I would say that that is an act of terror.
But Hezbollah doesn't give a damn about what Israeli civilians it kills when it launches its rockets. So what's the difference?
Israel doesn't give a damn either about killing Palestinians in Gaza or killing civilians in Lebanon. The idea that Israel is going to great lengths not to kill civilians and Hezbollah and Hamas are not doing that is just not a serious argument. All you have to do is look at all the civilians that the Israelis have killed, both in Lebanon and in Gaza, and many more Palestinian civilians and Lebanese civilians have been killed than Israeli civilians. It's not even close.
That is true, but you could use the same argument, as Israelis have done, that in World War II, nobody questioned the volume of civilian casualties when the Allies went after the Nazis, for example, when we were carpet bombing cities and so on. When people use that analogy, what do you say to them?
Well, your argument is that because atrocities have been committed by the Allies in the past, there's nothing wrong with Israel murdering huge numbers of civilians in Gaza.
Well, that's not my argument. No, it's an argument. It's an argument. Well, to be clear, it's not my argument. It's an argument I hear a lot from the Israeli side, which is, why are you lecturing us when our ratio of combatants, terrorists to them and to me, but when they go after Hamas and they believe they're killing 2 Hamas terrorists for every civilian that's been killed, and that ratio stands comparison with any modern warfare?
I don't think you can look at ratios. First of all, I reject that ratio. But I don't think you have to look at ratios to make an assessment of whether or not the Israelis are acting according to the laws of war or not. If you look at what they're doing in Gaza, it's clear to me that it's a genocide, that they are actually trying to murder huge numbers of Palestinians and effectively drive the Palestinians out of Gaza. This is a clear case of a state, Israel, pursuing ethnic cleansing in Gaza. They want to drive the Palestinians out. They want to make Gaza unlivable. And in the process, they are murdering huge numbers of civilians. And this is why the International Court of Justice ruled this past January that there is sufficient evidence to make the case that the Israelis are plausibly committing genocide in Gaza.
What they would say is that they face an existential threat fueled by Iran from Hamas and Hezbollah right on their border, that neither Hamas nor Hezbollah make any pretense of presenting an existential threat to Israel. Hamas's spokesman, within days of the October the 7th terror attack, brazenly said, we want to keep doing this as much as we can. When you have an enemy so publicly and brazenly saying, we're going to commit terror attack after terror attack against you of that magnitude, what else do you do when those terrorists operate amongst civilians and build huge tunnel systems around civilian locations? How else actually do you go after them?
Well, first of all, Piers, the idea that Hamas or Hezbollah represent an existential threat to Israel is not a serious argument. Just take Hamas, for instance. There's no way Hamas could capture for any sustained period of time territory inside Israel, much less threaten its survival. With regard to the fact that Hamas is interested in launching terrorist attacks against Israel, from Hamas's point of view, this makes perfect sense because the Palestinians are basically enclosed in a giant open air prison. And what they're trying to do is, in effect, break out of that open air prison. And one of the ways they do that is through terrorist attacks at Israel. And this, of course, is what happened on October 7th. It's not like October 7th happened in a vacuum. It's not like the Palestinians in Gaza were a bunch of Nazis who were just simply interested in crossing the border into Israel and murdering large numbers of Jews. The Palestinians were basically prisoners in this giant open air prison. And what they were trying to do was get out of that situation. And one can hardly blame them.
But it's not as simple as that, is it? Because Hamas had had power since 2005. It's pretty obvious now they spent the billions of dollars that were funneled their way in building this intricate tunnel system and in plotting to attack Israel, isn't it? I mean, I think a lot of people, the people I feel sorry for, are the Palestinians who did not want to be under Hamas control, who didn't vote for them, and who could recognize, as many of them will have done, that this was a pathway to madness. And what they did on October the 7th, the sheer scale of it, I mean, 8,000 people or more were killed or wounded in that attack. It's one of the worst terror attacks of modern times. So when you say that you dispute their ability to be an existential threat, well, actually, if they carried on doing that kind of thing, and Hezbollah joined in with far more firepower as they have, and Iran believed they really had Israel on the back foot, and they got others involved as well, then it could be an existential threat to Israel. Couldn't it?
No, I mean, I think what you're missing here is the big picture. I mean, what's going on is that Gaza and the West Bank are part of a greater Israel. And this greater Israel is an apartheid state. And if you look at how the Palestinians in Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank live, it's hardly surprising that they're trying to rebel against Israel. If you were a Palestinian and you were living in Gaza, I can be certain that you would be resisting against the Israelis the same way the Palestinians are.
Well, I certainly listen. I don't dispute that there's been a form of occupation, and we've seen evidence of that this week when Al Jazeera studio in Ramallah is suddenly shut down by the IDF. That can only happen if there is an occupying country exercising that kind of banana republic control over another people. I mean, so I accept that. I've never disputed that. But I do dispute your characterization of the threat as not being remotely existential, given you have them backed by Iran, and given Hezbollah certainly is a far more dangerous and far better armed and more populated group of terrorists than Hamas. If they all got together, I think, and others joined in and felt they had Israel on the run, I can see why Israel feel the way they do.
How Hezbollah or Iran or Hamas is an existential threat to Israel. Explain to me.
Well, when you have
how are they an existential threat?
Well, when you have tens of thousands of terrorists intent on committing heinous, large-scale terror attacks, that is an existential threat, isn't it?
No, it is not. You don't have tens of thousands of terrorists. There are probably about 30,000 fighters in Hamas and 30,000 fighters in Hezbollah. They don't have tanks, they don't have infantry divisions, they don't have artillery. In what way could they possibly be a threat to Israel, which is the most powerful military force in the Middle East? And furthermore, is joined at the hip with the United States.
Well, surely we saw exactly what kind of threat.
This is not a serious argument.
I'm about to give you an answer, which is that on October the 7th last year, we saw exactly what a serious threat it was. 2,000 Hamas terrorists came over the border and committed a series of appalling massacres. So right there is the threat, isn't it?
By Israeli accounts, 1,200 people died. This is
And
truly
nearly
regrettable
7,000
that
were
1,200 people
wounded.
died.
Nearly
but
7,000 were
this hardly
wounded.
represents an existential threat.
Well, nearly 7,000 were wounded. I mean, if you extrapolate that to America and a country of that size, then you're talking about 30 9/11s.
Again, there is no way that killing 1,200 Israelis represents an existential threat. There is no way that Hamas represents an existential threat, or that even Hezbollah and Iran represent an existential threat. How is Iran in any meaningful way going to threaten the survival of Israel?
Well, by fueling this kind of terror. I mean, the implication of what you're saying is, would you have been happy then to have allowed Hamas to simply stay in power? Would you be happy now if they wanted to stay in power?
Listen, I think from an Israeli point of view, you don't want Hamas in power. Although I will note to you that Benjamin Netanyahu was perfectly happy to have Hamas in power.
I agree, and I don't think
October 7th.
I agree. And to be
but
clear,
I understand why he doesn't want it in power now.
Yeah.
I understand that. But he talks about defeating Hamas in Gaza, and he's not defeated Hamas in Gaza. He's not going to defeat Hamas, and he has not defeated Hezbollah in Lebanon, and he is not going to defeat them no matter what he does in the future.
I mean, look, I think Netanyahu has a lot of self-interest here, which is connected to his huge unpopularity with his own people, who will clearly get rid of him the moment this wars is over. He also then faces corruption charges in a courtroom. So, I'm very skeptical of what his real motivation is for prolonging all this. And I don't think he has a plan or cares that much for what happens after it. So you don't have to, I'm not here to defend Netanyahu in any way. In fact, I think the whole region would be better off without Hamas and without Netanyahu and without Hezbollah. That's what I think.
Well, the truth is you wouldn't have Hamas and you wouldn't have a problem if there was no occupation. The taproot of the problem here is what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. Again, the Israelis are creating a greater Israel, which includes the West Bank and Gaza. And in the process of creating that greater Israel, they have built an apartheid state. And you should expect the Palestinians who live in that apartheid state to resist mightily. And that's exactly what's happening. And unless there's some self-determination for the Palestinians, you're going to have more and more uprisings in the future. You want to remember what happened on October 7th was not the first instance of the Palestinians rising up. There was the first intifada in the late 1980s. There was the second intifada in 2000, and there'll be more intifadas, more October 7ths in the future, in large part because how the Israelis treat the Palestinians.